Hello, my name is Angela Schumann, and this paper is called Shakespeare's Heroines versus Chesterton's, Balancing Romance and Reality. In 1901, G.K. Chesterton wrote 2.5 pages on the heroines of Shakespeare. In them, he claimed that while the true meaning of a hero as a kind of demigod archetype had all but been lost in modern literature, suffering instead a dilution to mean a man who is able to go through a few adventures without hanging himself or taking to drink, which is expressed in classic Chestertonian wit. In Shakespeare's heroines, he claims, the proper meaning of hero was still embodied. Chesterton lists 3 such paragons: Rosalind from As You Like It, Isabella from Measure for Measure, and Portia from The Merchant of Venice. In this paper, I will test Chesterton's claims that these characters embody the Elizabethan ideal of the holy, heroic, and pure woman. Through a close analysis of Shakespeare's texts, I will explore the darker elements of their behaviour and speech, which suggest that Shakespeare's heroines are much more complex than they at first appear. Having said that, the protagonist of As You Like It, which is our beautiful Rosalind, does indeed seem to fulfill Chesterton's vision of an unproblematic heroine. Rosalind shows a kind of heroic virtue in accompanying Celia into the dark and scary forest, taking on the man's role of the defender, complete with boots and hose and a sword. And this kind of makes sense if we think about it in terms of genre. These 3 plays are all comedies. However, As You Like It is the only pure comedy as such. Both The Merchant of Venice and Measure for Measure are problem comedies or tragicomedies, and that's because even though at the end nobody dies and people get married, nonetheless they flirt with death the whole way through, and they have these kind of quasi-tragic elements which naturally lend themselves to more complex characters. So yes, in keeping with the genre of pure comedy, Rosalind doesn't really have a dark side, and like Shakespeare's other comic heroines, she does have, unlike the men in the play, a fairly good understanding of herself. However, when we look at Isabella from Measure for Measure and Portia from The Merchant of Venice, things get a little bit more complicated. Let's look at Isabella first from Measure for Measure. Isabella has been seen by critics, audiences, other characters in the play, and significantly herself, as a paragon of virtue. Chesterton counts her among the high and snowy peaks which catch the last rays of the belief in the actual divinity of man. Beautiful. Similarly, the critic A.W. Schlegel once said that the heavenly purity of her mind is not even stained with one unholy thought. In the humble robes of a novice, she is a very angel of light. Okay, so this is very high praise coming from all sides. Does she live up to it though? If we look at her language and her behaviour closely, is she really as virtuous as everybody seems to think? When we meet Isabella, she's about to enter a convent, and all of a sudden she's being called upon to defend her brother, who has been sentenced to death by the wicked Angelo on a legal technicality of fornication. Immediately though, upon meeting Isabella, her first lines in the play demonstrate a psychological complexity and also a severe lack of self-awareness that is incompatible with virtue. The first question that she asks on her day 0 orientation day at the convent is, "And have you nuns no farther privileges?" The nun responds, "Are these not large enough?" And she says, "Oh yes, truly, I speak not as desiring more, but rather wishing a more strict restraint upon the sisterhood, the votarists of St. Clair." Now, the Poor Clares were one of the strictest orders you could find. They were extremely ascetic. So it's not really believable that the new girl on day 1 has decided that this just isn't hard enough for her. Her question instead shows that she's actually not quite cut out to be a nun. It's not what she thought it was. she's shocked, and fair enough, but she can't admit this to herself or to the nuns, so she quickly covers it over by saying, oh, I wish there were more privileges. You can even see this in the structure of her question. She asks, have you nuns no farther privileges? She doesn't ask, have you nuns no farther restrictions? Isabella's self-deception does not end here. Isabella, as her name suggests, Bella, is very beautiful. And she also has a strong sexual magnetism that gives her power over men. Her brother alludes to it when he, of all the people he asks to help him as he's being dragged off to prison, he asks for his sister, and he says, in her youth, there is a prone and speechless dialect such as move men. So we know that she's a great orator. We see that in the play, but it's not her words that he's talking about. There is a speechless dialect such as moves men. Again, another character, Lucio, points it out to her when he says to her, "Essay the power you have." She says, "My power? Alas, I doubt." And he says, "When maidens sue, men give like gods." While Isabella denies that she has this power, she also at the same time subconsciously uses her sexual attractiveness to manipulate Angelo in pleading for her brother's life. This psychological split is indicated through a series of Freudian slips in her speech, which are quite fun. At their first meeting, Isabella says to Angelo, she tells him to imagine that he is on trial for fornication and says, "Mercy will then breathe within your lips like man you made." Now, this is fun because it works on a couple of levels. On a conscious level, Isabella is simply speaking theologically. In the Christian sense, Christ has shown us mercy, and we are made new in him, and therefore we can go ahead and show mercy to others. However, it also works at a subconscious level. By saying man new made, she's referring to procreation. How do we make new people? It also works as an auditory pun. Man new made. If we think of new as a verb, K-N-E-W, and we think of maid as a young woman, M-A-I-D, in the biblical sense then, it's another reference to procreation, to intercourse, man new made, like Noah knew his wife. So she's able to make these sexual double entendres, and yet at a conscious surface level convince herself that she's only talking about theology. Isabella can see that she's had an effect on Angelo. He's turned his body from her, he's asked her to leave, he has his own issues regarding self-deception around sexuality, which are beyond the scope of this paper, unfortunately. But she can sense that this power that she has is working on him. And she's trying to get him to stay, good my lord, turn back, gentle my lord, turn back, but he's leaving. And so suddenly she just shouts, "Hark, how I'll bribe you." And Angelo's like, "You'll bribe me?" And she says, "Yeah, with prayers from preserved souls. I'll get my convent to pray for you." Now, any Christian knows that prayer is not something that can be bought and sold and exchanged for goods. It doesn't work that way. I mean, it could be, a covert reference to the selling of indulgences or something, but properly theologically speaking, one cannot bribe someone with a prayer. So then what on earth else might Isabella have been suggesting that she could bribe him with? And Angelo picks up on this, and later on he does try to blackmail her into sleeping with him in order to save her brother. But again, we can see in this moment here this psychological split and this self-deception. Isabella wants to think of herself as kind of above sexuality altogether, and yet she's using it beneath the surface to try and manipulate Angelo to win her brother's freedom. This becomes more intense as the play goes on. When we get to Act 2, Scene 4, Angelo is now determined to blackmail her. And he says pretty explicitly, "If in order to save your brother's life, you must lay down the treasures of your body, what would you do?" That's fairly clear. But she famously responds, "As much for my poor brother as myself. That is, were I under the terms of death, the impression of keen whips I'd wear as rubies, and strip myself to death as to a bed that longing have been sick for, ere I'd yield my body up to shame." So that's a lot. What is she saying? She's misunderstanding what Angela was asking, which is pretty hard to do because it was pretty clear talking about yielding up the treasures of your body. And instead she answers as though he was asking about martyrdom. She answers, yes, I would give up my life to save my brother. I would embrace martyrdom. So on a conscious level, she can convince herself, yep, that's what we're talking about. But nonetheless, the language that she uses is saturated with sexual imagery. And therefore it shows again this psychological split at a subconscious level. She knows what he's talking about, but she can't admit it to himself. It's this beautiful example again of this self-deception within her and this kind of suppressed and repressed sexuality bursting through in her language. Finally, so we've seen that Isabella is not really cut out to be a nun in the way she thought she was. She's not really above sexuality in the way that she thought she was. And finally, her kind of projected identity as a devoted sister to her brother is also undermined if we look carefully at her language and her behavior. When she is at first persuaded to plead for her brother's life, she states that she does so against her own will. She says, there is a vice I most do abhor, that I most desire to be punished, and that's what my brother did. However, and she says, for which I would not plead, but that I must. So, I wouldn't come here and plead for my brother's life. I think he should be punished. She should be killed for fornication, but I must. And then she makes this cold request. I have a brother is condemned to die. I do beseech you, let it be his fault, and not my brother, that is killed. And then when this request is denied, she immediately gives up. Oh, just but severe law. I had a brother then. Which is incredibly cold. And Lucio, the character who's pushing her to do this, he says that. He says, you are too cold, and he pushes her to keep arguing, and then she kind of gets going and she produces this brilliant oration. But initially, when her brother's life was on the line, she had almost no interest. When she visits her brother in prison later on, she assures him, oh, were it but my life, I'd throw it down for your deliverance as frankly as a pin. His response to her is, thanks, dear Isabel. But scholars have noticed that there's a pause, there's a missing beat in the meter, which suggests a hesitation on his part. It suggests that he's not quite convinced of her sincerity here. Oh, you would throw down your life for me. Thank you so much. I'm glad that's so easy for you. And after seeing her lack of self-knowledge throughout the play, I think we as audience and readers can also feel a little uncertain of Isabella's assurance here of her sisterly devotion. Let's move on to Portia from The Merchant of Venice. So Portia receives a lot of praise from Chesterton, and he definitely has this romanticized view of her. He claims that Portia is the most splendid and magnanimous woman in literature, and a figure representing the larger conception of generosity and persuasion. Whew, again, high praise, what a woman. Characters in the play seem to see her in this way too. They say she is fair, and fairer than that word, of wondrous virtues. From the four corners of the earth they come to kiss this shrine, this mortal breathing saint. Portia herself declares, I never did repent for doing good, nor shall not now. These claims invite us to examine her conduct in the play. Let's start with the flamboyant Prince of Morocco, who begins his casket test in Act 2, Scene 1 with an appeal to fair-minded colourblindness. So in order to win the hand of Portia in marriage, these suitors come from all around the world, and they have to they have to take a test. There are these caskets, and if they pick the right one, they get the girl. So he comes along and he says to her, "Mislike me not for my complexion, the shadowed livery of the burnished sun." So he's a black man, and he's asking, as Martin Luther King put it, not to be judged by the colour of his skin, but by the content of his character. This request seems to fall on deaf ears, however, because Portia dismisses his unsuccessful attempt with a racist expression of relief. "Whew, let all his complexion choose me so." Okay, so not great, but perhaps we shouldn't be too hard on Portia for her lack of 21st century sensibility towards racial difference. However, let's have a look at her treatment of Shylock in the trial scene and see if we can excuse that one, because she seems to show an undeniable nastiness towards him, an unnecessary vindictiveness. Given that, as she later explains, Venetian... So if we need a little brushing up on our plot of The Merchant of Venice, Shylock has gotten one of the merchants into this deal where if he can't pay him back, Shylock can take a pound of his flesh as payment because he really wants to kill the man. So now we've come to this crisis point where the man can't pay. Shylock's there sharpening his knife, ready to take his pound of flesh because he wants to kill the man. And then Portia, disguised as a male lawyer, intervenes in this. Again, it's a brilliant scene. It's a brilliant oration. Like Isabella, she's wonderfully intelligent and inspiring and engaging. So we're looking at this scene. So given that she later explains that Venetian law forbids as a capital offence an alien by direct or indirect attempts to seek the life of any citizen, she could and really should have simply put a stop to the trial the moment she arrived. She could have just explained this perilous position just to Shylock and said, "The law forbids you from killing any of our citizens. So sorry guys, this isn't going to happen today. Go home. Nobody's going to see a pound of flesh taken from anybody. That's it." This would have solved Bassanio's problem and saved Antonio unnecessary anguish and sent Shylock home empty-handed. It could have fixed everything. Instead, she begins with a lie. "The Venetian law cannot impugn you as you do proceed." Lie. Yes, it can. And then she follows it with many other lies, such as, "A pound of this same merchant's flesh is thine. The court awards it, and the law doth give it." Lie. The purpose of this, then, is to feed Shylock's hopes and encourage him to incriminate himself. Her suggestion that he pay for a surgeon to attend, which she knows he will reject, is in itself a lawyer's trick to entrap him into revealing his murderous intentions. And her much admired plea for mercy, which droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven, which really is beautiful, is in fact another ploy to alienate the sympathies of the court, because it is not couched in universal terms, but in a specific appeal to Christian redemption. "Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy." That's all well and good, and that's going to speak to a Christian audience, but of course Shylock is a Jew. So for a member of the Jewish faith, this doesn't hold water. Therefore, she knows that Shylock's going to reject it and therefore incriminate himself further in the eyes of the Christian spectators. This whole trial is a game of cat and mouse. She really seems to savor and enjoy. Tarry, Jew, just before you go, one more thing. She really draws it out unnecessarily. She relishes the exercise of her newfound power, which almost amounts to sadism. And this is not just confined to Shylock either. Antonio, who seems to be a bit of a rival with her for Bassanio's affections, comes in for a little gratuitous cruelty of his own as she gloatingly instructs him, "You must prepare your bosom for his knife." At this point, Antonio's really thinking that he's gonna be killed in front of everybody, and she lets him believe that. She takes her time in dispelling that myth. It would seem then that Chesterton may have romanticised these characters who, though undeniably intelligent and courageous and idealistic, are nonetheless more complex and problematic than they appear. They have their dark sides. Rather than being paragons of virtue, and not only Chesterton sees them this way, so many critics do, audiences do, other characters do, and most intriguingly, these two women themselves, Isabella and Portia, they see themselves in this way. They want to see themselves as saintly and heroic and virtuous. Nonetheless, when we read the plays closely, the behaviour and the language of Isabella and Portia suggests that Shakespeare wrote them with a more problematic, a more interesting, and ultimately a more human nature than has previously been recognised. Thank you.